So yesterday, Luke Thomas released his second video in what seems to be an ongoing series with a guy named Eric Kerner. I believe Eric is a graduate student in statistics right now, but he had brought some interesting studies to Luke's attention, so Luke decided to film some videos with him talking about some things. So the first video that they did was just talking about fighter pay in general. So he's looking at all the different disclosed pays from all the UFC events and graphed it up together and looked at how much fighters get paid, what sort of tiers there are, and kind of went beyond that just to break down fighter pay. The most recent video they just did, though, was on whether or not they think the UFC is a monopoly or, in this case, a monopsony. I'm not going to really play any clips from the video. They did put out it's like a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll go through that. If you want to watch the video, I encourage you guys to do it just so you can hear from their standpoint. If you're thinking, hey, 45 minutes is too long, there's a cool thing on YouTube where you can go to playback speed here and then go to like 1.75 or 2.0, and they just talk a little bit faster that way. So that can turn a 45-minute video into a 30-minute video or shorter, depending on how fast you want it. So even if time is your excuse not to watch it, I still would say just up the playback speed and go through it. It's worth your time. But just to go through what they were saying, their general finding was that they don't think the UFC is monopoly, but they do believe it is monopsony. Now, one of the big issues I have with this video is that in the first video, the guy went through a ton of data on all the different UFC fighter pay. So it was kind of like, all right, well, it seems like he kind of has like an educated standpoint on what he's saying here. But on this one, they just said it's monopsony, but they never really bothered to explain why. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk about why they're actually wrong about that, and the points they make aren't even true. So this is just going through here. So this is like the title slide here, just saying UFC is a monopsony. Fan perceptions are just some of the things that they were going to discuss. So then this first slide here is just talking about what a competitive market is. So there are a few slides in here where they're just kind of defining economic terms or economic theories. So then this here is just kind of like a graph of what it looks like in a competitive market equilibrium. And then they get into monopsony. So the idea of the monopsony versus a monopoly is that a monopoly is that you have one firm as a seller as far as like selling items. So if we're looking at MMA, the monopoly would be if the UFC is the only MMA promotion out there. Obviously, that's not the case. We all know of plenty of other promotions that are out there like Bellator, One, LFA, Ryzen. I mean, you can go down the line on that. And then the version of monopsony would be that there's one company that seems to be setting prices on things. So if you were to imagine there's like, well, the example they gave was like NHS out in Britain. Now, I don't know a whole lot about healthcare out in England, so I really couldn't tell you whether or not that was an accurate example, where they're saying that the government's the loan buyer, so they're the ones who set the price. So in this case, it would be like the UFC is the loan buyer of MMA talent, so they would be the ones who set the price on what fighters are worth. So that's what the claim was. Now I'll get into why I don't agree with that. But then they were saying price taker versus price maker. So in the monopsony case, it would be a price maker. And then larger surplus for monopsony, lower rates of employment, and lower wages for workers. Now they were saying the reason it's not just a traditional monopsony is that in a traditional monopsony, there'd be deadweight loss on the consumer. And in this case, that's not really the case. There's plenty of fights. There are fights all the time. We oftentimes complain that there are too many fights going on. So he broke it down into what he determined to be a price discriminating monopsony. So this was his way of saying, no, they're not a standard monopsony, but they are a type of it. So they're saying that they're a price discriminating monopsony. So monopsony that pays their workers at individual reservation price, that's the lowest price a seller is willing to sell a good or service. So this is where we start to disagree. So if you're looking at fighters, and he gets to it later on, let me see if that slide is here. There's something about 10%. It's somewhere in there, but in the video, he was saying that like the top 10% of fighters, they're the ones who can really negotiate. So your guys like a Conor McGregor or a Cyborg, the ones who once their free agency runs out, they can expect to have a lot of competitive offers from different promotions. That those guys aren't really stuck in this case, but that the lower level guys are. If you wanted to actually look at it, if you look at what a lower level UFC fighter, where they come from, oftentimes these are guys who do well in smaller promotions and then work their way up. So then the question would be, all right, well, what do they get paid in smaller promotions? So here is a look at some LFA fighter salaries. And I picked this one in particular because it has Eric Silva on the card. Eric Silva made pretty good money in the UFC, so you'll see what he made in LFA versus what he was making before in the UFC. And you'll see there's a massive difference. So in Eric Silva's case, he actually went from I don't remember what his last salary was in the UFC, but even if he just made 10 and 10, he went from above 10 and 10 to making 2.5 and 2.5 on this card. But you look at some of the other guys on this card, Like, they're not making much money at all. So if the idea is that they're getting paid reservation price, the UFC could just match what the LFA is paying, and then in that case, they could say, "Hey, look, we'll match what you're making at the LFA, but if you're fighting with the UFC, you have the chance to work your way up to something higher because you get your name out there in front of more people. We have a bigger platform." If the UFC was what they're claiming they were, then their prices would be set much closer to these numbers than they would be to the 10 and 10 minimum. Never mind what they're actually paying for guys who start picking up wins and actually becoming more marketable in the promotion. So just going through here in case you are just listening in. So Silva made 2.5 and 2.5. The next highest guy on the card made 1.2 and 1.2. Another guy made 1.2 and 1.2. We had a 1 and 1, 1 and 1. A guy made 1800. A guy made 900 and 900, 1750. Like these numbers for what is basically the highest tier minor league show, it's nothing close to the minimum of the UFC of 10 and 10. No one here made $20,000. The closest person to $20,000 on a win was Eric Silva, who made $5,000. Another thing people like to talk about is that they say that what the UFC does is so unique. It's hard for anyone else to come in and do something similar where they're just having the top fighters. That's not really the case either. There have been people who've tried that. So Strikeforce tried that for a little while, and eventually they got sold to the UFC. And the reason why they got sold to the UFC is that they're investors who were part of an ownership group that also owned the San Jose Sharks. They weren't liking the money. They weren't liking the returns they were getting, probably in part due to the fact that the fighter salaries were so high. And eventually they're like, hey, look, we just got to sell this off. And they ended up selling off to the UFC. But a company that did not sell off to the UFC, but also tried to compete with the UFC by having top level MMA was Affliction. So if you look at the Affliction salaries here, in this case, it was a company that's like, hey, we'll go along with what a lot of people are saying right now. And a lot of people are assuming that a lot of these top MMA fighters aren't being paid what they're worth. So we're going to go ahead and pay these guys what they're worth and see how that works out for us. So if you look at these salaries here, Fedor, $300,000, Tim Sylvia, $800,000, Andrei Arlovsky, $750,000, Ben Rothwell, $250,000, Josh Barnett, $300,000, Pedro Hizo, $70,000, Bob Lucibral, $90,000, Mike Whitehead, $50,000, Matt Lindland, $300,000, Fabio Nascimento, $20,000, Lil Nog, $50,000, Mike Pyle, $20,000, Vitor Belfort, $140,000. Terry Martin, $30,000. Paul Blantello, $80,000. Gary Goodrich, $25,000. So in this case, you actually have a company that's trying out this little thought process that you keep hearing in MMA all the time, where it's like, oh yeah, well, if you just paid the fighters what they're worth, if you paid them more, then it'd be better for the fighters, but then you can also succeed as a business. Well, Affliction lasted 2 shows. They didn't succeed as a business. So just this idea that just if you pay these fighters a ton of money, that all of a sudden it's going to be great for them and it's going to be good for you because you're going to be able to pull all the top talent. That's been proven untrue. But another thing they were talking about is that at the lower level, that there really is no competition. So if you're looking at those LFA fighters, so I'll just pull a name. So we'll say Moses Murrieta. So let's just say that he wants to earn some more money. The idea would be that he either has to take 10 and 10 from the UFC or he really can't take anything close to that. Well, if you look at Bellator salaries, what you actually find is that not only do the top guys get paid money, but they also pay well to people who they deem as prospects, guys like an AJ Agazarm or like a Dylan Dennis, even an Aaron Pico. But they also pay pretty well to the guys who are working their way up in the division and are pretty competitive. So if we look here at Bellator 214, so there's Ryan Bader, 150,000, Fedor, 300,000. So these guys were sort of well established. Those guys who would be in the top 10%, as Eric Kerner was talking about before. But then you have Henry Corrales, who wasn't a champion in Bellator at any point, just a guy who's a good contender. He made 35 and 35, so $70,000. Jake Hager is sort of a guy who was brought in as a celebrity. He made 50 grand. But Juan Archuleta, another guy who who isn't a former champion, but it's a up and coming prospect. He made $25,000, so that's above the 10 and 10 limit at the UFC. Ricky Bandejas made $30,000. So you're seeing that there are guys who are sort of in that lower rung that are making well above the UFC minimum Bellator as well. So in the video, they just claimed, hey, look, unless you're in the top 10% of earners in the UFC, you're not going to have any sort of negotiating power. You're not going to be able to negotiate within other companies. But when you look at the fighter salaries of other companies, that's obviously not true. So I guess in conclusion here, while it's nice that we got this little economic lesson where he's talking about price floors and all these other aspects of markets, the fact that they never went in depth on the MMA market in particular and looking at salaries across different promotions, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I don't know why they wouldn't look into it when they were pretty detailed in the last video, but in overlooking that, they made a point about a monopsony that wasn't even true in the first place and never really bothered to prove it. So hopefully next time they make a video, they get a little bit more detail than they did in this one.